On the morning of February 22, 2026, helicopters lifted off from the roof of the Marina Palace in Cotonou, Benin. They did not leave ceremonially. They did not leave with handshakes or diplomatic farewells. According to accounts emerging from the region, foreign military and intelligence personnel departed in what observers described as an unscheduled rapid evacuation, the kind that does not appear on any official itinerary, the kind that governments deny happened at all, and the kind that, when it does happen, tends to mark the end of something much larger than a single operation. This is where the story begins. Not with a declaration of war, not with a coup, not with a single bullet fired in a capital city, but with the sound of rotor blades over the Gulf of Guinea. And the silence that followed. To understand what that silence means, you need to understand the landscape into which it fell. West Africa in early 2026 is not the West Africa of 5 years prior. The region has undergone one of the most compressed and consequential political transformations in its post-independence history. A chain of military transitions in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger removed governments that had been deeply integrated into Western security architectures, particularly France's Operation Barkhane framework, and replaced them with juntas that, whatever their internal contradictions, shared a single animating principle: that the sovereignty calculus in their countries had been wrong, that foreign military presence had not brought stability, and that a different arrangement was necessary. Whether you call that Pan-Africanism, anti-imperialism, or simply nationalism, the political energy behind it was real, and by 2026, it had been consolidating for the better part of 3 years. The Alliance d'États du Sahel, the AES, formed initially in 2023 between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, was, in its early months, treated largely as a defensive posture. A collective security agreement between 3 landlocked, economically constrained states that had broken with ECOWAS and burned their diplomatic bridges with Paris. Analysts debated whether it would hold. Skeptics pointed to the economic pressures, the continued insurgency activity despite the removal of French forces, and the internal tensions within each junta's governance structure. These were legitimate concerns. But those analysts underestimated one variable that would prove decisive: Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. Young, ideologically sharp, and operating with a deliberate theatricality that translated extraordinarily well into the social media environment that now shapes public opinion across the continent, had by late 2025 emerged as the most visible symbol of the AES's political ambitions. Where the leadership in Bamako and Niamey communicated in the careful register of post-coup governance, Traoré spoke in the register of a movement. He consistently framed Burkina Faso's security operations not merely as counterterrorism, but as a theater of civilizational contest, a struggle over who ultimately controls African territory, African resources, and African political futures. This framing resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. What happened in early 2026 in the northern border regions that straddle Burkina Faso, Niger, and Benin became the operational expression of that framing. Reports from regional security sources and cross-border monitoring networks described a coordinated AES security operation, the operation that circulating narratives have labeled Operation Clean Sweep, targeting insurgent networks that had for years exploited the porous tri-border zone. The precise tactical details of what occurred remain incomplete. The AES states have not published a comprehensive operational account, and independent verification of specific claims is ongoing. But what does appear consistent across multiple sources is this: the operation was notable not primarily for its military mechanics, but for what it exposed about the political architecture that had been underwriting instability in the region. The allegation, and it must be stated clearly as an allegation because full documentation is still emerging, is that the insurgent networks that the AES operation disrupted were not simply autonomous militant formations operating in a political vacuum. The claim, advanced by sources aligned with the AES states and echoed in regional political commentary, is that these networks had external patrons, and that the disruption of those networks revealed the extent to which Benin's northern border had functioned as a corridor, a space where security arrangements nominally serving Cotonou were, in practice, serving different interests entirely. This is where Benin enters the picture. and where the events of February 22nd begin to take on their full weight. Benin, under President Patrice Talon, had, by 2026, become something of an outlier in the immediate sub-region. While its Sahel neighbors were extricating themselves from Western security frameworks, Benin had deepened them. The country had accepted expanded foreign military advisory presence, particularly in the context of the growing insurgency pressure in its northern Atakora region, where jihadist groups affiliated with both JNIM and ISWAP had been mounting increasingly ambitious attacks since 2021. From one analytical perspective, this made sense. Benin was a smaller, coastal state with fewer resources than its neighbors and genuine security pressures. From another perspective, the one gaining traction across the AES states and their public audiences, Benin had effectively become a buffer state, a platform for foreign intelligence activity directed at Sahel governments, that those foreign actors could no longer operate from directly following the military transitions. The tension this created was not abstract. It was geographic and operational. Benin shares a long northern border with Burkina Faso. Its territory lies between the AES bloc and the Atlantic Ocean, between the landlocked Sahel states and the maritime trade routes that have historically defined West African economic dependency. For the AES, Benin's posture was not a neutral security choice. It was a geopolitical problem. Is this reading too stark? Perhaps. Beninese officials and their diplomatic partners would characterize it differently. They would point to the legitimate security pressures Cotonou faces, the genuine threat of jihadist expansion into coastal states, and the legal frameworks under which foreign cooperation occurs. These arguments are not without foundation. But the events of February 22nd suggest that on the ground, in the institutions that actually execute policy, inside the Beninese military, inside the security services, something had fractured. The reported refusal of Beninese soldiers to carry out orders to suppress civilian populations represents, if accurate, an extraordinary rupture. Military discipline in any state depends on the belief among soldiers that the chain of command serves a legitimate national interest. When that belief collapses, when soldiers look at an order and see it not as a national directive, but as a directive being issued in service of someone else's agenda, the institutional cohesion that makes a state governable begins to dissolve. This is not primarily a military story. It is a story about political legitimacy, about what happens when the citizens who make up a country's armed forces stop recognizing themselves in the government that commands them. The imagery of this, soldiers standing down, foreign personnel evacuating, a palace effectively vacated of the external architecture that had been sustaining its authority, carries a weight that goes beyond the specific events in Cotonou. It carries the weight of a pattern, because this is not the first time in recent African history that the visible departure of foreign security infrastructure has coincided with the collapse of the political arrangements it was propping up. The question is always the same. Was the instability caused by the departure, or was it the presence itself that created the conditions for collapse? The AES states and the political movements aligned with them have a clear answer to that question. Their critics have a different one. What February 22nd appeared to demonstrate, in at least one reading, is that the populations and the soldiers living inside these arrangements were beginning to reach their own conclusions. By the time the helicopters left the Marina Palace, the regional dynamic had already been shifting for weeks. The negotiations that would ultimately produce what is being described as Togo's treaty granting AES states sovereign port access had been proceeding, carefully, quietly, through diplomatic back channels that deliberately bypassed the formal ECOWAS framework. Togo's decision to conclude that agreement represents one of the most significant strategic pivots of the entire regional realignment. To understand why, you need to understand the geography of economic pressure. When ECOWAS moved to impose sanctions on Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger following their respective military transitions, the bloc was, in effect, attempting to use economic geography as a tool of political coercion. These are landlocked states. They cannot access international markets, cannot import fuel, pharmaceuticals, manufactured goods, or export gold, cotton, and agricultural products without passage through neighboring coastal states. The implicit argument of the sanctions regime was that economic pain would produce political compliance, that the juntas would moderate, negotiate, or eventually fall under the weight of public discontent generated by supply disruption and rising prices. It did not work, partly because the juntas proved more resilient than anticipated, partly because alternative supply routes through Algeria and other northern corridors partially offset the pressure, partly because Russia's Wagner Group, later rebranded under the Africa Corps framework, provided both security services and a political alternative that blunted the isolation strategy. But the fundamental vulnerability remained. As long as the AES states were denied reliable, sovereign access to maritime trade infrastructure, they remained structurally constrained in ways that limited their geopolitical options. Togo's agreement changes that calculus materially. Lomé's deepwater port is one of the most capable maritime facilities on the West African coast, purpose-built for high-volume container traffic, strategically positioned, and historically a hub for trade flows that serve the entire sub-region, not just Togo itself. If the terms of the reported agreement do in fact grant AES states sovereign access to this facility, meaning not merely commercial access through Togolese intermediaries, but a legally codified arrangement that the AES bloc can rely on independent of Lomé's day-to-day political relationship with Accra, Abuja, or Paris, then the economic blockade strategy that was ECOWAS's primary leverage instrument has been effectively neutralized. This is not a small development. This is a structural shift in the balance of power within the regional architecture. And what makes it particularly significant is who made it happen. President Faure Gnassingbé of Togo has, for decades, navigated one of the most difficult political positions in West Africa. A leader whose own legitimacy has been contested domestically, whose relationship with France has historically been deep, and whose foreign policy has always been defined by a careful calibration of competing pressures. That Gnassingbé chose to formalize this relationship with the AES bloc at this specific moment tells you something important about how the regional balance is being read by actors who have skin in the game and long institutional memories. What happens next could redefine the entire economic architecture of the subregion. There is a version of the analysis that treats all of this as essentially a narrative coup, a propaganda exercise in which events that are genuinely complex and contested get flattened into a clean ideological story about African sovereignty defeating foreign manipulation. That version deserves to be taken seriously. The AES states and their aligned media ecosystems have demonstrated considerable sophistication in shaping how their operations are perceived. The framing of February 22nd as a moment of ideological victory rather than military action is, itself, a strategic choice. It elevates the significance of what may have been a limited operational moment and invests it with the rhetorical weight of a historical turning point. Audiences and analysts should approach that framing with the same critical attention they would apply to any state-produced narrative. But, and this is the important qualification, the existence of strategic framing does not mean the underlying events are fabricated. Helicopters either left Cotonou or they did not. Soldiers either stood down or they did not. A port agreement either was signed or it was not. The framing shapes the meaning attributed to these events. It does not create the events themselves. And the accumulation of these events, the evacuation, the military fracture, the treaty, the coordinated operation, even stripped of its ideological packaging, describes a regional environment that has moved significantly from where it was 12 months ago. The foreign actors most directly implicated in this realignment, primarily France, but also the United States and European security partners who have maintained advisory and intelligence presences across coastal West Africa, face a strategic dilemma that does not resolve easily. The strategy of using coastal states as platforms for influence into the Sahel and of using economic pressure through ECOWAS to discipline the AES governments has demonstrably not achieved its objectives. The AES states have not moderated, have not returned to civilian governance frameworks acceptable to Western partners, and have not severed their Russian security relationships. Meanwhile, the political cost of the association between Western presence and these governments, in the eyes of regional populations, has been rising steadily. The question that French and American strategic planners are now being forced to confront is whether the platform states on which this strategy depends, Benin, Ivory Coast, Senegal, are politically stable enough to sustain continued investment, and whether the regional perception of that association is manageable. The events described around February 22nd suggest that in at least one of those states, the stability assumptions may have been overstated. This matters beyond West Africa. The AES bloc success, if these events are confirmed and sustained, will be observed carefully in other African contexts, where governments are navigating between established Western security partnerships and the alternative frameworks that Russia, China, and regional actors are now offering. The signal effect of a coastal state appearing to fracture under the weight of its external security commitments would not be lost on political actors in the Sahel's eastern neighbors, in the Great Lakes region, or in the Sahel's northern approaches. Geopolitical models that appear to work become templates. That is how regional dominoes fall, not through military conquest, but through demonstrated viability. The role of information in this transformation cannot be overstated. One of the most structurally important dynamics driving the AES bloc's political influence is the collapse of the information architecture that previously shaped how these events were understood. A decade ago, the primary narrators of West African security events were Western wire services, French-language media ecosystems with deep ties to Francophone African political elites, and the official communications of governments aligned with the Western security framework. Social media has not merely supplemented this architecture. It has, among younger African audiences in particular, substantially displaced it. Ibrahim Traoré's ability to project the AES narrative across borders, to generate mass emotional identification with the sovereignty framing, to make a young soldier in Cotonou feel more ideological kinship with Ouagadougou than with the advisors in the Marina Palace. This is not accidental. It is the product of a deliberate and effective information strategy operating in an environment that is now structurally favorable to that kind of appeal. And it is also, importantly, not entirely manufactured. The grievances that animate the Pan-African sovereignty movement in West Africa are real and documentable. The historical record of French military intervention in African political succession, the CFA-Franc arrangement's structural features, the asymmetric benefit distribution in resource extraction arrangements. These are not conspiracy theories. They are the documented history of the Franco-African relationship as it functioned for decades post-independence. What is new is not the underlying reality, but the political technology through which that reality is now being mobilized, and the geopolitical environment shaped by the multipolar competition between Western and non-Western great powers that makes the mobilization consequential in ways it was not a generation ago. What does Benin do now? That is, in the immediate term, the most pressing operational question. If the government in Cotonou has genuinely experienced a fracture in its security establishment, if soldiers have refused orders, if the external architecture sustaining certain operations has been visibly disrupted, then the Talon administration faces a governance crisis that operates simultaneously on military, political, and international dimensions. Restoring cohesion within the military requires a credible account of what the military is for and who it serves. Providing that account becomes significantly more difficult when the visible evidence, helicopters leaving, advisors evacuating, suggests the answer to that question has been contested at the highest levels. At the same time, Cotonou cannot simply pivot. Benin's economic and security integration with Western partners is deep and not easily unwound. Its relations with Nigeria to the east, with Ivory Coast to the west, and with the broader ECOWAS framework constrain its options in ways that the Sahel juntas, having already paid the cost of rupture, do not face. Talon, or whoever governs Benin through the political turbulence now apparently underway, will be navigating a space in which every choice has a significant cost attached, and in which the domestic legitimacy question, who does this government serve, has been made dramatically more urgent by the events of February 22nd. For the AES states, particularly Burkina Faso, the challenge now is consolidation, operational success, in the counterinsurgency theater, in the diplomatic arena, in the information space, creates its own pressures. The populations that have rallied behind the sovereignty framing have expectations about governance, about economic improvement, about security in their daily lives, that military success in a border operation and a port treaty do not by themselves fulfill. Traore and the broader AES leadership are operating under significant resource constraints, continuing internal security pressures, and the constant friction of governing complex, diverse societies through non-democratic frameworks that lack the legitimacy mechanisms that civilian governments, however imperfect, possess. Winning the geopolitical narrative is not the same as winning the governance challenge. That distinction will become increasingly important as the initial momentum of the transformation period gives way to the harder, less cinematic work of building durable institutions. The Togo arrangement may prove to be the most durable strategic gain of this entire episode. If it holds, if the legal and logistical mechanisms actually deliver on the sovereign access commitment, it changes the AES's strategic horizon in ways that extend far beyond the immediate security situation. Access to a reliable maritime corridor means access to international markets on terms that are not contingent on ECOWAS cooperation. It means the ability to build economic relationships with Gulf states, with Asian trading partners, with South American commodity markets that do not route through the political choke points that have been used to apply pressure. It means, in effect, that the economic siege strategy has failed. And when a siege fails, the political theory of change that animated it has to be reconsidered. The day the helicopters left Cotonou will be cited in the historical record of this period as a marker, not because a helicopter evacuation is, in itself, a decisive event. Evacuations happen, situations are reassessed, assets are repositioned, but because of what that departure represented in the context of the accumulated momentum of the previous 36 months. It represented the visible, undeniable acknowledgement that a strategy had reached its limits, that the platform it had been operating from had become unstable, that the political architecture it had been sustaining could not sustain itself. Whether what replaces it is genuinely better for the populations of West Africa, for the farmers in Burkina Faso's northern provinces still living under genuine jihadist threat, for the traders in Cotonou whose livelihoods depend on regional stability, for the young people across the sub-region for whom the Pan-African sovereignty narrative is both an inspiration and, as yet, an unfulfilled promise. That question is not answered by an evacuation or a treaty or an operation. It is answered over years and decades of governance, of institution building, of economic choices, of how power actually functions when it is no longer performing for an audience. The cameras will move on. The next crisis will emerge somewhere else, demanding attention. But the geopolitical shift that these events represent, the apparent fracturing of the coastal buffer state strategy, the neutralization of the economic blockade, the demonstrated capacity of the AES bloc to project operational and diplomatic reach beyond its own territory, will not move on with them. It will remain embedded in the regional architecture, shaping every calculation made by every actor operating in West Africa for years to come. The helicopters have left. The questions they leave behind are only beginning to be answered. What form of order emerges in the space they vacated? Who controls it? And whether it serves the people who have invested so much political hope in this moment? That is the story that now has to be watched. And it is a story that, unlike the clean narrative of February 22nd, will not resolve quickly or cleanly. The real test of what happened in Cotonou is not whether the foreign advisors left. It is what was built after they did.